In recent days, Poland has witnessed an unprecedented event in its modern history. The migration crisis on the Polish-Belarusian border is the first clear example for Polish society of a change in the structure of the global order. Polish political elites, so far preoccupied mainly with internal power struggles, were mercilessly awakened from their geostrategic sleep. Why did Lukashenko cause a crisis on his own border? What scenarios are possible, and what does the new Polish army have to do with all this? Welcome to the 20s Report.
Border crisis.
War is a tool for achieving political goals. In this sense, a traditional kinetic war, such as World War II, is no different than a hybrid war fought locally and with relatively few resources. Hybrid war, or to be more precise, hybrid conflict, for this is how all actions below the official threshold of war are defined, includes, among others, social activities, weaponization of migrants, information warfare, and the activities of special forces and/or paramilitary groups. The world has observed such actions since at least 2014, the year of Russia's aggression against the Ukraine. The next iteration of this form of political pressure is taking place now, through the precipitation of a migrant crisis by the Republic of Belarus. In mid-2021, the Belarusian regime, headed by Alexander Lukashenko, launched a new migration channel. At first, the target was Lithuania, but after some time, the Belarusian authorities redirected the inflow to the Polish border. On November the 8th, 2021, events escalated with several thousand, and possibly more, migrants being transported to the Bruzgi-Kuznica border crossing. Interestingly, a few days earlier, on November the 5th, at the meeting of the Council of the Union State of Russia and Belarus, the two countries signed a package of integration agreements. It assumes, among other things, the adoption by Russia and Belarus of a common migration policy and military doctrine. This fact, together with statements made by high-ranking Russian politicians, confirmed Alexander Lukashenko's belief that his actions have the full support of Moscow. One might ask why Lukashenko needs a conflict on the border. Now, the answer may seem simple. It's clear that Minsk's actions are a form of revenge by Lukashenko against Poland, Lithuania, and the European Union in general for supporting the Belarusian opposition after the 2020 elections, as well as for the sanctions imposed on his regime. It is almost certain, however, that Belarus's hybrid actions are, above all, part of the internal Belarusian-Russian game, with Belarus acting as Moscow's political bumper while it pursues its goals of destabilizing the EU's and NATO's eastern flank, as well as Ukraine. In fact, the recent number of coinciding events is puzzling. On November the 8th, the day the crisis escalated, Belenergo, a Belarusian energy company, announced that it was immediately breaking its contract to supply electricity to Ukraine, at a time when the country is currently experiencing an acute energy crisis. Perhaps there would be nothing surprising about this were it not for the fact that deliveries had begun only 7 days earlier. What's more, Moscow had recently stopped deliveries of gas through the Yamal pipeline, which runs through Belarus and Poland and onto Germany and the EU. Although Lukashenko boasts that Belarus will buy gas from Russia at prices several times lower than those paid by European countries, blocking Yamal will effectively cut off Belarus from revenues generated by gas transit, which gives the Kremlin another tool to pressure Lukashenko. There is also speculation in the press about the dislocation of nuclear weapons to Belarus, and about extending the lease of two military facilities for another 25 years. On the other hand, Belarus still does not formally recognize the annexation of Crimea, which Russia considers a slap in the face. Although Lukashenko makes it clear that, informally, this has already happened, the Kremlin expects a formal stance from him. Despite the seemingly friendly relations between Minsk and Moscow, we were in fact dealing with a constant game of smiles and declarations in the foreground, while in the background a merciless struggle for efficiency and political maneuvering is taking place. It is likely that destabilization of the Polish border is an additional tool for Lukashenko to use in his maneuvers with Moscow. For example, unleashing a crisis and allowing Moscow to be the final arbiter may be traded for resumption of Russian gas transportation through Yamal. The escalation of the border crisis is in the interest of the Russian Federation, which treats it as part of its bullying strategy and as a form of pressure on Western states, while formally not bearing any responsibility for it. The migration crisis fuels social and political discord in Poland and tests the resilience of Poland's security system, its armed forces, and NATO as a whole.
Information warfare.
One of the most important domains in any modern conflict, including this current border crisis, is the infosphere. It is not important what happens on the ground. What matters is the message that goes out to the world. Whoever wins the narrative war is the de facto winner of the entire game. The Russian and Belarusian authorities report that the West is responsible for causing the migration, because it supported American moves in the Middle East. The Belarusian side and the Russian language media accuse the Polish state of inhumane actions and of violating human rights. These include the forcible detention of migrants forcing their way across the border and the use of tear gas to repel the assault. All of this is most often fueled by images of women and children appearing online. This narrative is being joined by some political circles in Poland, who are calling for the admission of those camping at the border, which is in line with the goals of Belarusian propaganda. The question that needs to be asked at this point is, are we dealing with a humanitarian disaster? Now, according to the European Court on Human Rights, Poland must provide food, clothing, medical care, and, if possible, temporary shelter to migrants camped at their border. However, Belarus refuses to allow Poland to send a convoy into its territory with humanitarian aid for migrants, thus refusing to provide assistance. Besides, it is clear that all people who received a visa to Belarus first had to prove that they had sufficient funds for accommodation and normal life functions in Belarus. The price that migrants had to pay to smugglers approved by the Lukashenko regime, according to various media leaks, ranges anywhere from $2,500 to $15,000. The Lukashenko regime seized this money in order to use these people instrumentally for its own gain. When the first people realized that they were victims of fraud, they tried to return to the airport, but the Belarusian police turned back cabs transporting migrants. This culminated in the Belarusian authorities transporting these migrants to the border and then cutting off their way back. In a word, Middle Eastern migrants are now prisoners and hostages of Lukashenko, who plays with human lives to achieve his own political goals. Belarus used to operate several dozens of flights per week from Dubai, Baghdad, Damascus, Beirut, and importantly, from Istanbul and Antalya. This would not have been possible without the tacit approval of Turkey, Poland's ally within NATO. Whereas Poland and Turkey recently signed an agreement for the delivery of Turkish Bayraktar TB2 unmanned aerial vehicles worth over $250 million. The Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs denies that it supports Lukashenko's smuggling activities, but it is likely that Polish-Turkish relations will be damaged as a result. As expected, EU and NATO countries reacted very differently to the crisis on their eastern border. Although Lukashenko's actions have been condemned at the declaratory level and a fifth package of sanctions has been announced, their impact is likely to be reduced relative to the initial intentions. For example, one of the sanctions is to exclude Belavia, the state-controlled Belarusian air carrier, from the market for aircraft leasing contracts. Now, this would effectively ground their aircraft because it would force Minsk to buy them back, for which it has no money. However, Ireland, where most of the providers of such services are located, opposed this scenario, proposing that sanctions be imposed only on new leasing contracts. Another idea was to exclude Belarus from the global agreement on aviation data sharing. But here too, the Lukashenko regime is preparing to get around that by creating a common aviation space with Russia and a joint administration to manage it. It's not difficult to guess that declarative support comes mainly from Berlin. One should remember that Poland is only another stop on the way to Germany, so the Polish buffer for the Germans is very useful in this case. Although now the German media report that single groups of migrants from the direction of Belarus have found their way to Germany. Just as importantly, the current game can be costly for Belarus and Russia. A sudden influx of thousands of migrants destabilizes the situation in Belarus. If Lukashenko does not bring the situation under control, his legitimacy in the eyes of many influential people in his own regime's departments, who in practice ensure his power, may decrease. The sanctions package imposed on Belarus has not resulted in a freeze of trade. On the contrary, as Belsat reports, in the first 9 months of this year, trade with EU countries has increased by more than 40% and is now back to pre-pandemic levels. The main trade partners of the Republic of Belarus remain Germany and Poland. Therefore, a complete closure of the border with Poland would be a real blow to Minsk. It would be equally costly for Moscow, since the main land route connecting Russia with the European Union runs through Belarus. Added to that, there is a dry cargo port, Małaszewicze, on the border with Belarus. This is the largest dry port in Europe. Hundreds of trains from East and Central Asia are bound for it as part of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. Małaszewicze handles 90% of all goods brought from China to Europe by rail. If Belarus climbs up the escalation ladder, Warsaw may take steps to close this artery. This would certainly be met with a reaction from Moscow and potentially even from Beijing. Now, it should also be remembered that the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, which is crucial for the Kremlin, remains inoperable. Although it is very close to completion, it is still a potential disciplinary tool in the hands of the West. Poland effectively guards the border, so further steps up the escalation ladder by the Republic of Belarus are likely. This may include provocations with weapons. Interestingly, in the Russian city of Kazan, the forces of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, or Russian NATO, are practicing protecting a refugee camp and exporting convoys with humanitarian cargo. It is therefore possible that, after a series of escalations, Vladimir Putin will suddenly enter the game, introduce Russian guards to the border, and present himself to the world as a stabilizer of the situation, which will be welcomed with relief and even gratitude by Western countries. Such a reaction in Moscow will be taken as a success, and confirmation that this type of policy brings the intended results. The media reports that Angela Merkel has already made the first call to Putin asking for help in solving this crisis on the border.
The end of strategic sleep.
The November crisis on the border was preceded by another very important event in Poland, perhaps even a breakthrough, ending the period of strategic sleep in which Polish policymakers have been stuck since the 1990s. The leader of the Law and Justice Party, Deputy Prime Minister Jarosław Kaczynski, who in practice is now the most influential politician in the country, held a press conference about the fracturing of the world order, hybrid war, and Russia's offensive posture. He also pointed out the limited ability of NATO to help Poland in a new generation war, which may last only a few days or weeks. So by the time NATO troops, or the Americans to be precise, come to help, it could already be over. Thus, he stressed the need for Poland's military autonomy, which has not manifested itself in the views of the ruling party so far. In response to these challenges, Kaczynski announced that Poland must be able to defend itself, and for this purpose it needs